to another episode of Unlocking California Politics. My name is Sanjay Wagle. I'm the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs with the California Association of Realtors, and today we are joined by Assemblymember Gabriel, Chair of the Assembly Budget Committee, a very powerful committee. He was elected to the State Assembly in 2018 and has since been recognized as a California influencer by the Sacramento Bee. As the chair of the Assembly Budget Committee, he works closely with legislative leadership and the governor to shape the state budget, push forward key policies, and oversee hundreds of billions in state spending. Assemblymember Gabriel, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sanjay. It's good to be with you.
Thank you, and again, thank you so much for joining us. In late June, Governor Newsom and the state legislature reached a deal on the 2024-2025 state budget. The deal that was reached included some tough cuts because we've had a bit of a crisis this year, as state revenues were down with a deficit of $27.6 billion, more or less. And can you share your thoughts about the final budget and what you think still might need to be done during the remainder of the legislative session?
Yeah, thank you. So obviously, as you mentioned, I have the great honor of serving as chair of the Assembly Budget Committee, and this was my first year. And Speaker Rivas, who appointed me, always likes to tease me that he appointed me to be chair of the Budget Committee, and then 2 weeks later, they announced that the state was facing a record and historic deficit. So I don't think those two things are connected in any ways, but obviously a very challenging year, challenging circumstances that I stepped into. I'm actually very proud of the final product that we put forward. I think that it achieved a lot of the core objectives that we were looking to achieve in crafting the budget. Certainly for us, some of those priorities were to protect the programs and services that we know a lot of Californians rely on, things that are essential, particularly to some of our most vulnerable communities. But at the same time, take the steps to tighten our belt. Like we know families do every month, that we know that people, that businesses out there have to do when times are tough. And so we went through very methodically to evaluate our spending and to be very thoughtful and mindful about where we made cuts and to do that in a responsible way. And then also to place a big emphasis on accountability and oversight and making sure that we are getting the return on investment for our precious taxpayer resources. So it was a challenging process. It's never easy to have a down budget. It's a lot less fun, I imagine, than having a budget surplus, but I'm proud of the work we were able to do. Certainly a credit to the really hardworking members of the Budget Committee who took the laboring oar there. And so I feel pretty good about it. And to the second part of your question, we actually have done most of the work. So I expect, knock on wood, we're sitting here with 4 weeks left in the legislative session. We'll have some little bit of cleanup related to the budget, as there always is, some tweaks that we need to make, but I don't expect a lot of heavy activity related to the budget in these final few weeks of session.
Okay. The budgets, as you mentioned, of course, given the situation with the deficit, required some cuts, and that included some housing and unhoused programs, which we know are a priority for the state. Housing is, of course, I don't think I even have to say it is one of the main issues for the state and now the whole United States. Very clearly, it's a nationwide problem, although nobody else, I think, is facing $900,000 median home prices like we are. The California Dream for All program, which we are strong supporters of, provides down payment grants and an innovative shared appreciation programs to first-time home buyers, and has been, in our view, a huge success over the past few years. What do you think of this program?
Yeah. So first of all, let me say I agree with you. One of the issues that I talked about when I ran for office was our state's housing crisis. It is a top priority issue for me. I know it's a top priority issue for Speaker Rivas, for our Appropriations Chair, Buffy Wicks, that I do a lot of work with. And it's something that we are eager to work on to really try to move the needle on it. And one of the things that I have said in the few years that I have been in state government, the more you look at all the problems that the state is facing, you really uncover that all roads lead to housing, or almost all roads lead to housing. And so many of the challenges that we face, from people who are having super commutes because they can't afford to live where they work, or the challenges that we have with all of the carbon that's going to the atmosphere from those super commutes, a lot of these things are fundamentally related to our housing crisis. And we know that there's a lot of people that can no longer afford to buy homes in the communities in which they were raised, or the communities in which they grew up. And so it is a major public policy challenge. And I know that you all at the Realtors have been an important, a really, really important voice in meeting our housing supply challenges. And I'm someone that believes that one of the solutions to our housing crisis is just to build a lot more housing and to make housing more accessible and more affordable, because we know it is part of the California dream and it is part of the American dream. And so, I've always been supportive of the program that you mentioned, in part because I see home ownership as an engine of social mobility. It's how families can hopefully get into the middle class, how they can accumulate some wealth. And so it's been a priority for us in the budget as we were making cuts to protect housing programs, and something that I hope we will be able to continue to work on.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the mobility aspect of intergenerational and social mobility, because that's one of the frustrations I think that we've seen in terms of the realtors, as you mentioned, homeownership is a strong value for us. And one of the frustrations I think from our side or our perspective is we know we need housing, as you said, we need to build everything. We need to build tons of rental housing. We need we need lots of homeownership opportunities, but especially the majority of now first-time home buyers reflect our diverse state, and it seems like it's quite a tragedy that we reduce those opportunities right as we become diverse and everybody has housing opportunities. Whereas when the state was less diverse, those housing opportunities were abundant. We've really got to try to restore that from our perspective. Now, budget cuts are always tricky to navigate. Nobody wants to see any programs cut. And for our listeners who might not be familiar with the process, there's negotiations between the Senate, the Assembly, the governor, various stakeholders. What was the process like for you, and what would you think listeners would be helpful for them to understand about the budget process?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it can be a little bit of an opaque process at times how the state budget is crafted. And so one of the mandates that I had from Speaker Rivas was to make it an inclusive and transparent process. So we really wanted to make sure that all of our membership was involved, that the budget agreement that we reached was reflective of the priorities of the Assembly and certainly of the legislature and in conversation with the governor. And so we just really focused on making sure that we did the process right. We had more than 70 hearings, so there was a public vetting of all of the different issues and ideas. We sat through hundreds of hours of public comment where stakeholders and members of the public could come up and weigh in on all of these things. And I'm a big believer that people will accept outcomes that they don't prefer, or maybe they strongly disfavor, if they feel like the process has been fair and transparent. And so, we had to make some tough cuts. We had to make some tough choices. That is part of responsible leadership. And there were nights, candidly, when I, was laying awake in my bed, really struggling with some of the choices that we had to make, because there are real impacts on the lives of Californians, and in many ways, moral dimensions to these choices when you're talking about programs and services that can benefit people and are most vulnerable. But we knew that there was no way to avoid that. And so for me, I was like, we need to lean into the fact that we need to make tough choices. Part of what I wanted to do and the speaker wanted to do was also not to kick the can down the road. So we used some of the reserves that thankfully the legislature and the governor had built up over many years, but we didn't want to use all of them because we don't know what lies ahead. We know there may be stormy seas ahead. And so we wanted to make sure that we were doing this in a thoughtful and responsible way. And so because we had such a public vetting of all the issues, and I really want to give a shout out to our very talented and hardworking budget subcommittee chairs who leaned into that process. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we had a budget where I assume that probably every member of the legislature said there are parts of this budget that I don't love, and I would have done it differently. But I think people felt good about the fact that at least they understood why those decisions were made. They saw that there was a lot of conversation and that we approached that thoughtfully. And ultimately, I think that's why we were able to land in the place that we did, is because of that process.
Great. So, do you think that there was a lesson learned from that, being more transparent for everybody? That is something that will carry forward into the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly will continue to be a big priority of mine. I know it's a priority for the speaker. And one of the things that we talk about in our office also is restoring public trust in government. There's a lot of skepticism right now. Frankly, I think a lot of that is well-deserved. There's skepticism in institutions across the board, but particularly with government. And so my view here is when we do things the right way, it gives the public confidence that people are acting in the best interests of the citizens, of the taxpayers, of the people that were the residents that sent us here, the communities that we represent. And so it's something that we're very eager to continue while we're in this role.
Okay. And I'm being a little facetious here, but I've always been convinced people will trust government once you hear somebody go, I had a great experience at the DMV. But anyways, as soon as that happens, people will be like, I love that government. So now switching gears from the budget, I'm going to talk about the housing shortage, which we've talked about a bit. The 2030 deadline approaching, we're short still by all accounts about 2.5 million housing units. including 1 million affordable units for low-income families. We anticipate it's going to be, what do you think we'll be able to do over the next 5 to 6 years? And I'm recognizing, as I mentioned earlier, this is a nationwide problem. This is something which the whole country is now facing. You know, for a while, it looked like maybe we were anomalous California, but we really are. It starts here, the rest of the country, it follows. Do you think Governor Newsom's executive order last week will be helpful to this process? What other kinds of things do you think we can do?
Yeah, I do, and I appreciate the governor's leadership with that executive order and other things that he and his administration have done. My approach to all of this, and we sort of alluded to this earlier, is to have an all of the above strategy. And I think our responsibility, and I often talk about this with Charlie Weingarten in my office, who is one of my advisors on housing, is how do we address this issue in the most thoughtful way? And it means that we need to give the tools and resources to local governments to build more housing, because we know that ultimately at the end of the day, a lot of this is in the control of local government. A lot of my colleagues came from local government. Folks there are fiercely protective of their powers over land use and development, but it's our responsibility to give them tools and resources. And so those tools and resources may be things like financial resources, tax credits, all of those things. It may be tools like streamlining. But another part of this is that we have to hold them accountable. And we have to make sure that they are following through, because everybody has to do their fair share in building more housing that we need. And we need it at all levels. This is something that I talk a lot about. We don't just need affordable housing. We need market rate housing. We need workforce housing. You know, sometimes we call that missing middle. I don't want to live in a community where the only people who can afford to buy or rent are folks who are in subsidized affordable housing and people who are in high-end luxury housing. I want teachers and cops and firefighters and nurses and you know, ordinary working families and middle-class folks to be able to afford to buy homes and to live in my community. Even in some of the bills we've done, we've seen that there are places in the state where they can't attract firefighters or they can't attract teachers because those people at those in those professions cannot afford to live in those communities. And so I'm a big believer that we need an all of the above strategy. We need to push forward on all of this. And there isn't going to be a magic silver bullet solution to this problem. So there's a lot of things that we need to do to cut red tape, to streamline, to make it easier to build, to incentivize building, and ultimately have to work hand in hand with the private sector to build, to make up for the really significant shortfall that we face.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's exactly where we stand. All of the above is something we've really got to move forward on. And the one thing I was just going to say with respect to, and we were, Speaker Rivas spoke at our legislative day, and he mentioned, I believe right now we're at 21 $1 million zip codes or something like that in California. And, you know, that's, on the one hand, it sounds, wow, that's cool. But it's actually a sign of something wrong. And I agree, we're going to have to do something. And yeah, and especially, as you mentioned, the middle class housing is especially important. We have studies in our economics department about, you know, the biggest single driver of all these concerns about middle class people leaving is housing costs, not, you know, the attractiveness of Texas otherwise.
Correct. And I think it's actually a big thing as we think about California's competitiveness. How do we attract and retain the innovative businesses that we want? Well, there has to be housing that's affordable for people. It has to be, you know, to hire the talented workforce that they need to be able to be competitive. There has to be housing for people. And so again, as we think about all of these different issues, I think a lot of the challenges we face on our economy and making sure that we're competitive with other states for the innovative companies that we want here in California, again, for me, that road leads back to our housing crisis.
Right. Now let's talk a little politics, since we are in a very interesting political era with over last month. As you know, there was historic news with President Biden deciding not to run for a second term. Vice President Kamala Harris, now the Democratic nominee for president. And when I was writing this question, there was no, there was not a vice presidential part of that ticket, but there is now. This has been a lot of significant change in the dynamic for the election. Historically, presidential elections have generally meant higher Democratic turnout because, for whatever reason, marquee races seem to drive a part of the Democratic electorate out. But there have been concerns, I think, with Biden that turnout might have been more depressed, as well as other issues going around the world. But Do you see some changes now that the race has changed and the candidates, and what do you think? How do you think that'll impact fall?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't even know when this podcast is going to air, so I'm hesitant to make any bold predictions because things are changing so rapidly right now. But
Hmm.
certainly, let me say a couple things. One is I think President Biden has done a phenomenal job as president of the United States. I think history will and historians will judge him
Hmm.
very favorably. Some really significant accomplishments in a very difficult environment of divided government and frankly dysfunction in Washington D.C. And
Hmm.
he has really been able to navigate the ship through some choppy water. So I will always have tremendous respect for the president. I do think there has been a palpable sense of energy and enthusiasm and momentum with Vice President Harris. I know, to paraphrase President Obama, we are fired up and ready to go. I know members of the Democratic caucus, activists that I talk to in my community, members of my family. I mean, people are really excited about this ticket. The vice presidential selection, I think, was an excellent one. So I think we're going to be competitive, and I think the dynamics of the race have changed, and you're going to see a lot of Democrats that are excited to get out to vote. I think more young people are going to be excited to show up to the polls to see a new generation of leadership taking the mantle. And I am really excited about this new ticket and feeling the energy and momentum behind it at this moment.
Okay, getting more into the predictive era, if you're comfortable
Yeah.
talking about how you think that might impact the state races for Senate or Assembly.
I have heard, it's interesting that you mentioned that because I was talking the other day with some of the folks who are running for the legislature, and all of the Democrats in swing seats are feeling really good. They feel like there has been an injection of energy and momentum from the Harris campaign. They see that the voters they're talking to are more excited. Their volunteers are more excited. So I do believe, and interestingly, one of the most important roles that California is going to play in the national race is not necessarily in the presidential election. I have a pretty good sense that Kamala Harris is going to win her home state, and it's going to be in the Democratic category. But as you know, we have some uber competitive House races
Correct.
here
Correct.
that are very much on a knife's edge. And we also, in many of those cases, there is an overlapping race for the state Senate or the state assembly in those purple districts that is very
Hmm.
close. And so my sense just from talking to folks and really talking to those candidates who live in those communities and who are knocking on doors and interacting with people is that this change is going to really have a down ballot effect that's going to benefit Democratic Party.
So let me just expand on that a bit. Democrats already have a supermajority.
Yeah.
Were that to get bigger, based on your prediction, how does the party itself manage that size?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I don't know that things will get bigger. I mean,
Yeah, it's
we just went through some redistricting, as you and I were talking about before, of redrawing of the legislative districts, and we're already at a pretty, we're super majority. I don't know what the right word is. It's been very interesting to me to come up here. A couple of things. One is I tell folks back home that they would be surprised by how much of the work that we do up here is nonpartisan or bipartisan.
right.
And we have some really great relationships with some of our Republican colleagues. We find common ground on issues that we can work together on and that will benefit all of our communities. And the other thing is, as you know, as a very seasoned and savvy observer and participant in politics up here, is that just because people have the same letter after their name doesn't necessarily, two people with a D after their name, one of whom is from coastal California and one of whom is from inland California, can have very different policy
Oh, right.
priorities and very, very different takes on things. So even though we all may be part of the Democratic Party and the Republicans, their caucus, there's often divisions within the caucus. And some
Right.
of those play out, on the front pages of the newspaper and in committee hearings and in debates on the assembly floor or the Senate floor. So, I think a lot of this is going to be driven by the individual candidates. What are their policy priorities? What are their values? Where are the issues? Where are they going to line up? Are they more progressive? Are they more moderate? Are they more focused on certain issues or others? And so I don't know. And either way, as you know, we're going to have a very significant turnover. There's a lot of seats
Right.
that are up. We're going
Right.
to have a whole new crop of elected officials, and I can already tell even in this session where we've had a relatively high number of new members, I can feel that the priorities of the caucus have shifted in some ways,
Interesting.
and that the people's take on certain issues, and also obviously with what's going on, hot issues that the electorate cares about, that the people that we represent care about. So I don't know, until I get to meet some of the, until we see how some of these races turn out, until we get to meet
Right.
some of these new folks, until they have to start taking votes. I always say people can say whatever they want when they're running for office. It's when you have to start taking those votes that it really shows who you are. The votes are what speak about your priorities and your values. We won't know, and so it'll be interesting to see how it all unfolds.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting what you said about there is a degree of civility and bipartisanship on legislative issues here. We've actually had comments from people who were persons or senators here who then went to Congress and said when they spoke to their, a Democrat or a Republican saying, "Oh, I'm having lunch with my Republican or Democratic colleague from we knew each other in assembly." Other members of their caucuses would go, "Why? Why are you
Yeah.
meeting with the opposing party?" And they're like, it's really,
It's not, it's not, it's
unfortunate.
not, it's not right. And it really, it may not be popular to say, but I began my career after law school as a staffer working on Capitol Hill. And I was there for what was probably the last era when there was some real bipartisan cooperation. And it was a really cool thing to witness where people, and it didn't mean that people sacrificed their
Right.
values. It didn't mean that they weren't strong advocates for what they believed in. There was a sense that the way that you help people and the way that you serve people is by finding solutions that can work for folks from different communities with different values. And that the win wasn't destroying the other side. The win wasn't doing something to burn the process down, but it was actually building up and finding consensus and finding common ground. I think that's what a lot of Americans would like to see now. They would like to see ways for us to work together. And candidly, a lot of the issues that we work on up here and that people care about are not partisan issues.
Right.
And they're things that shouldn't be partisan. They're things that we should be able to come together across party line. And I have really enjoyed the opportunity to work with, as you know, we have an incredibly diverse legislature. And I have people who represent communities that do not look like mine, demographically, economically, politically. The top issues in their communities and what people are thinking about may be very, very different than what people in my community are thinking about on a day-to-day basis. But there are things that they share in common.
Right.
And finding those areas where we can work together, to me, is a really important part of this job.
Finally, what is the best way, for your constituents or constituents of any member, of course, but let's take your constituents to participate in the process? You mentioned, for example, there was a lot of discussion during the budget process. You got a lot of feedback from the public, not just lobbyists or other members. What's the best way for people to really get involved to make their voice heard?
I think step number one is to reach out to your elected official and let them know that you're thinking, let them know what's on your mind, what you care about. People may have some skepticism that if you email your elected official or call the office, that kind of goes into the ether. I will tell you that's not the case. I get a memo from my district office staff in the San Fernando Valley. We call it the Thursday memo because I read it every week when I'm flying home on the plane back down to the valley. And it lists for me all of the issues we've heard about that week, right? And I sit there on the plane and I look and I see what have people and how many phone calls did we get and what are the issues that people care about and what meetings did my staff take. So I know that people have skepticism about that, but reaching out to your elected officials matter. Certainly the realtors, I think, have perfected this skill to some extent because y'all are very, very involved in the community. And I always joke that, wherever you go, whether I'm at Encino Little League or, speaking to the Chamber of Commerce or whatever it may be, the realtors are always there. And I've developed some beautiful relationships with folks in my community, but just being involved, approaching people, talking to them. The way that I look at it is I work for the people in my district.
Right.
These are my bosses. Those are the people that sent me there. So we also try to meet people where they are. So my staff is out at a lot of community events and, it could be something like a concert in the park where we are every weekend, right? It's just a chance for people to come up and tell us what's on their mind, give us some feedback. I can't be at all these events because oftentimes I'm up here in Sacramento, but all of the conversations, ultimately help to inform me and help us think about the choices that we're making up here.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Whenever I talk to people, especially in the Los Angeles area, my friends who are still there, and I tell them, you can actually, they really care what you think.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah.
They actually, somebody pays attention? They pay attention.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And I will say, I think that is particularly true in the legislative area, I think legislative level of government, we are more accessible in many ways than I think people understand. The other thing, if you're able, and I know it's not something that everybody can do, but coming up to Sacramento is very powerful.
Right.
Right. I mean, if you come up here inevitably and put in a meeting request, you will get a meeting with either me or my chief of staff or the staffer that is working on that policy and have the opportunity to make your case. And it is very, as a policymaker, it's actually very helpful. One of the biggest challenges of our job is the number of issues we have to deal with. I always ask people when I'm out at a town hall or a community meeting, I say, guess how many votes I take in a 2-year session. And they say 250, 500, they guess. And when I tell them that I take an average of 6,000 votes in a 2-year session, it blows their mind.
Right.
And so the biggest challenge for us is trying to learn and understand all of these issues to be able to deal with all of it. And so when constituents come and flag something for us or say, hey, this is really important to people in your community, it has a very helpful thing of putting that on our radar. And, when I'm going through my vote recommendations before committee or before floor session, my staff will put in there, we heard from the Woodland Hills Warner Center Chamber of Commerce on this issue,
Right.
or constituents of yours came up and met with the legislative director about this issue, and that's helpful information to me, so I understand how this is an important issue to people in my community. So let's really try to get this one right.
Thank you, Assemblymember. That was actually very helpful, and we might be reaching out to get a little part of that for our legislative day. to
You got
convince
it.
our
You got it.
realtors, those who are often wonder, like, is it worth making the effort? And most of them do. We have a very strong presence, as you know, on on our legislative day. But anything we can do to get more. So I think that was very helpful.
Yes, yeah. Alice McCain and Jody Francisco and all of my realtors are always here. So, and I always look forward to seeing them. So,
Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much for being here. If there's any last words you'd like to say to us.
Well, I told you
as a
before we
realtor.
started, I had a very difficult question for you.
Okay.
And I think this is a question that people in my community would want to know the answer to. So I was looking at your very impressive biography, and I saw that you have a law degree from USC and a master's from UCLA. So what I want to know is, are you a Bruin or a Trojan?
I lean more toward the Trojan
You
side.
lean more towards the
Yes.
Trojans. Okay.
Yes,
All right.
I
Well,
absolutely do.
So I have 2 staffers in my office who will be very excited about that, and some in my capital that will be less excited about that. So anyway, both great schools.
Thank you so much.
All
Thank
right.
you again for being here.
Thanks
you.
for having me.
Disclaimer. The purpose of this podcast, brought to you by the California Association of Realtors, C.A.R., is to provide general and educational information and opinions from a wide range of perspectives regarding politics, voting, elections, legislative issues, and more. The opinions, beliefs, and views expressed by guests or participants of this podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, beliefs, or views of C.A.R., its affiliates, their respective directors, officers, or employees. Reference to any individual or entity does not constitute an endorsement, recommendation, or any other position or opinion regarding that entity or individual by C.A.R. This podcast does not constitute professional advice or services of any kind. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast.